Thanks, Brandon. Next up is Kevin Rigby from Yale University.
All right, so my paper is called "They Gonna Leave with More Lead That They Poison Me With: Corin Gaines in the Racial Life of Lead." Um, and I have two epigraphs or whatever, that I'm gonna come back to later, but I just will read them really quickly. One is from Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. What? Yeah, sorry. Okay. Between colonizer and colonized, there is only room for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinishness, brainless elites, and degraded masses. No human contact, but relations of domination and submission which turn the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. My turn to state an equation: colonization equals thingification. And then the second one is from Anthony Farley's The Color Line is Capitalist Accumulation. Negotiation requires the slave to pretend it has something in common with its master. Slaves and masters have nothing in common, and there is therefore nothing to negotiate. Negotiation is always already at its beginning the almost escaped slave's surrender to its almost former master. There are many mansions in the master's house, each filled with the beauty of yesteryear's dreams of legal emancipation. Cool. So, black people have a long history with lead. From Flint to Baltimore and many other poor black cities throughout the country, black people live literally and figuratively, live literally and figuratively with unique proximities to lead and its physiological, mental, and discursive effects. This paper takes particular interest in lead's discursive effects on how we are unable or able to make legible or legitimate black radical politics and praxis of refusal and reoriented relationships to death, toxicity, and non-sentient things. This paper also asks of the affective adjustments we might need to account for when thousands of black children live and grow up in such close proximity to lead and the effects of this exposure. How does the ubiquity of the toxin reorient relationships to risk, death, and health? How do we account for lead-inspired and more generally toxic, deathly cultural vernacular and mythos? What does it mean to live so closely to death, ontologically, materially, and affectively? Looming so often, always, already with and among, how do we understand the relationship between blackness and lead in these contexts? How do we account for the ways in which lead, a non-sentient material, can be deployed by state and media actors at the nexus of social medical discourse to, quoting Zakiya Jackson, animate biopolitical realizations and affectivity that uniquely foreclose on and violently deny the mere fathomability of black insurgent political aim or action? Returning to the case of Corin Gaines, I hope to answer some of these questions or propose more questions to them, and finally, offer a reading and holding of Corin and black people like her, slain by the state, guided by an ethics of representation, of annotation, of aspiration, of what Christina Sharp might call wake work. Corin Gaines was a 23-year-old black woman and mother of two children who was murdered by police after a SWAT unit arrived at her home to execute a failure to appear bench warrant connected to a March traffic stop. Approximately 5 hours later, after what police originally described as an attempted negotiation wherein Corin threatened to shoot them and allegedly did open fire, was shot dead, and her son, whom she was holding in her arms, was wounded by gunshot. The police who killed her were never charged. Immediately following the incident, Corin's videos of the March traffic stop, her being released from jail afterwards, and of the fatal incident with the SWAT unit went viral and were circulated by people across social media and news media outlets. Speculation about Gaines's mental state based on a possible history of lead poisoning as a potential explanation for her behavior circulated immediately as well. The Washington Post, Vox, Huffington Post, New York Times, and BET's online news division, among others, all circulated news reports and articles that rendered lead as possessing a paradigmatic materiality and exposure to its toxicity, a pathological condition that, borrowing from one Washington Post article, allowed for the racial anxieties animated by the event to be, quote, diffused by viewing it through the race-neutral prism of mental illness and the tragedy of lead poisoning, end quote. So basically what I'm curious about at this point is how we get to this kind of like deracinated assessment of the state murdering a black woman where the state can escape culpability and give it to her silent killer, lead poisoning, which is kind of this thing that I'll come back to. But to get to like how this is all possible, I want to return back to Césaire's equation, which allows us to think more critically about the possible relationships between humans-made things and other things, so that one's proximity to material, to toxin, etc., and the ways in which this proximity is able to animate particular racial anxieties can be made clear. In taking recent interventions by Afro-pessimist scholars that insist on the singularity of slavery, Césaire's argument figuring colonized people as instruments of production allows us not only to think about the ways in which master narratives produce materials and human objects together simultaneously, it allows us to think something of the bondedness of the affectivity of and between materials and specific racialized human objects as well. I want to argue that more important than the ways lead animates racial anxieties when attached to certain raced human bodies, the unique total objectification of blackness is such that the object distinctions between lead and blackness can collapse. The affects this relationship produces occurs simultaneously and indistinguishably. The effect this has on the affectivity of materials in discourse is such that in relationship to blackness, they can become paradigmatic, over-determining the field of possibility for black consciousness, politics, and action. So if Césaire expands our capacity to think about possible relationship between humans and things, Mel Chen's engagement with lead in her book Animacies, Biopolitics, Racial Mattering, and Queer Affect illustrates the ways a, quote, non-active chemical element is able to mobilize an almost hysterical range of affective anxieties about race, nation, childhood, and sexuality. Or, put differently, to think more expansively about the range of affections possible between humans and non-sentient material. Chen convincingly argues for the animating potency of lead, demonstrating the ways inanimate matter can animate particular affects that force us to challenge the distinction between living and dead. While for Chen, when lead is tied to white American children consuming toxic imported Chinese toys, lead animates national anxieties about an Asian invasion that compromises white American job security, national identity, and ways of life. As I argue, when lead meets blackness, it adopts an obfuscating paradigmatic materiality whose animating affects, which we might say cluster around the permanence of the effects of lead exposure and concomitant biofuturist anxieties around cognitive impairment, foreclose any possibilities of radical political thought or praxis. For Chen, it is the lead toys imported from China that produce racial anxieties around nationhood and the perilous dangers of the Asian other, but it is not the Asian body itself wherein the threat of lead's exposure are located. Asians are not made of lead. There is an achievable distance between the Asian other and toxic object, though the Asian other may produce toxic objects. That prevents this collapsed relationship between lead and body that condemns black people. Conversely, when Corin Gaines was killed by police, lead was deployed to diffuse the anxiety around the otherwise incoherent threat of black resistance. For Vox, lead poisoning would certainly help explain why, from Heavy, a developmentally disabled woman, who, per the Washington Post, had all the markings of someone not fully in control, would take the course of action she did. It was, said one BET article, her silent killer, lead poisoning. The argument here is not to refute the possibility of Corin suffering from lead poisoning, rather it is to draw particular attention to the ways lead was deployed as an intelligible means of delegitimizing and pathologizing Corin's refusal to comply, negotiate with, or submit to state power. The ubiquity of lead in the built environments of many poor black people and the confluence of social and medical discourse on the effects of lead poisoning and the total objectification of the black subject collapse object distinctions so that animated anxieties around lead and black bodies resisting can become indistinguishable. The fear of lead, the way it threatens to bring its human host close to death, insanity, and incoherence, and each of these things kind of as the other, becomes indistinguishable from the threat of black resistance. Blacks, it would seem, are indeed made of lead. So if we can think about the ways both blackness and lead are rendered similarly in discourse, and if we can refuse animacy hierarchies that foreclose the affectivity of non-human matter, we can better understand the ways black folks might reorient their relationships to matter in their built environments that create the possibility for radical thought and praxis. As I will demonstrate with a close reading of a poem by Corin titled Ink versus Lead, the virally circulated videos and eyewitness accounts, possibilities for new ontologies disinvested in liberal humanist discourse on life and toxicity become possible. If the language of insanity, as Calvin Warren suggests, quote, provides grammar to describe the incommensurability between freedom and blackness, end quote, which is also the necessary grammar of prohibition, or the discursive and medical utility through which the state deals with beings considered civilly dead because they are nonetheless integral to the state projects, we can not only understand the potential of reorganized relationships to lead, but the ways in which the state, via disproportionate and overdetermined rhetoric on insanity, prohibits and makes illegible this potentiality as well. So there's like this long poem by Corin that I'm not gonna read all of. I'm just gonna like offer like some brief thoughts on just like the title, but that's the whole thing if you wanna read it. It's also on her Instagram if you want to go to her Instagram, but we can talk about that later. For sake of time, I'm not doing all that. So, but just thinking about the title, Chin reminds us that to pump someone full of lead is to kill them. The metaphor of weaponry is apparent in the title. Here we are called to think not only of the ways corn has been pumped full of lead and thus conscripted already to a certain kind of death, but of the inverse as well. Ink versus lead just as immediately resonates with ballot versus bullet, a meditation on one's political relationship to the state. And we are called to imagine the ways Corin, beginning to enjoy writing with lead instead of ink, might have been reimagining her own body's toxicity and militancy. So I'm just gonna switch gears to the second half of the paper. In the afterlife of slavery, the dynamics of, quote, the dynamics of naming and valuation remains grounded in originating metaphors of captivity and mutilation. The human subject is murdered over and over again. Spillers. This is a non-negotiable position. This is a non-negotiable position, a relation of domination, of unceasing death, a dominant symbolic activity wherein Corin's choices are between a state of unfreedom and a refusal of life in an anti-black world. It is under these circumstances we must consider how black people reorient their relationships to life and death, the choice between slavery and death, the impossibility of negotiation. These are the incoherences the collapsed distinction between blackness and lead make illegible, but it is also this collapsed distinction wherein Corin reorients her relationships to life and death, made herself into the graphite used as a part of the pencil that makes a mark, which is one of the definitions of lead, chose the bullet over the ballot and refused to be stolen. Put differently, this was not just a crazy black woman having a bad day. Reorientations to life and death, disinvested and recuperating liberal humanist narratives of life and humanity make possible black radical praxis that imagines otherwise. To see the case of Corin's death through the race-neutral lens of mental illness and lead poisoning, as the Washington Post encourages us to do, is to see insanity as an ontological feature of blackness. This is an orientation that makes freedom impossible, an orientation whose coherence depends on black subjection. But what of the reoriented relationship? When one's life is marked by a proximity to death and insanity, when one chooses an orientation disinvested in conceptions of life that depend on one's enslavement, what relationships to life, death, care, and the body become possible, become necessary? Corin promises the police who pull her over that they will not kidnap her or steal her car. "You will have to murder me, I promise you," she says. "I already warned my family about this day," she tells them. "I'm not scared of y'all, and I'm not complying to y'all's criminal fucking ways," Corin continues. "You see these little rebels in the back seat? I'm gonna live on forever, my nigga, forever." Moments later, Corin turns to her children. Her voice softens. "I love you," she tells her children in the back seat. She kisses them. "Mommy loves you. Don't cry. Don't be scared." "You see what they do to us?" she asks her son. "They are not for us. They want to kill us, and you never ever back down from them." The police interrupt her. "We don't want to kill you. We're your friends," they tell her son. "Do you believe that?" she asks him. He shakes his head no. The police tell her not to lie to her son. "I don't have to lie to him. I can pull up a video for him right now of y'all killing people for no fucking reason that look like his daddy, his uncles." She is right. Moments later, the police walk back to their cars. "Yeah, they came to kill some shit today," she says. 3 months later, Corin posts a video to Instagram of her sitting on the floor in her home, loading a rifle with bullets. In part, the caption reads, "They gon' leave with more lead than they poisoned me with." Corin's house is surrounded by a Baltimore police SWAT unit. They've kicked through the door and an officer stands, rifle in hand, at the doorway, staring at Corin as she records him. Next door, her neighbor's apartment has been taken over by the police. He is not allowed to leave his home as the police drill holes in his wall to watch Corin. In another video posted to Instagram, Corin's son is shown. He is calm. He is looking at his mother behind the camera. Corin asks him, as they are watched by the SWAT officer in the doorway, "What are they trying to do?" "To kill us," he replies. "Do you want to go out there?" "No." "What do you want to do?" "This," her little rebel replies. The negotiation, if we can call it that, lasts only 5 hours before the witness says the police had had enough. "I'll come out if you put your guns down," he says, Corin said. He overheard the chief of police on the scene refuse her demand. He had had enough. They stormed Corin's home and killed her. They shot her son in the arm as he fled his mother's dying, bleeding body on the couch. The police say she shot first. The witness, her son, say she never fired a bullet. But one might imagine the ends of these stories are one and the same. Christina Sharp, in her powerfully unsettling text, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, reminds us that the orthographies of the wake, the air currents behind a body in flight, something in the recoil of a gun, end quote, requires quoting again, new modes of writing, new modes of making sensible. She proposes black annotation toward reading and seeing something in excess of what is caught in the frame because, as David Marriott reminds us, these videos cannot act as witnessing to what we know or imagine as the death of this person, a death which remains outside the time and processes of the televisual image. Corin, her life caught in the recoil of a gun, refused to negotiate and made an impossible demand that the violence against her, the interminable gratuitous production of her death, stop. So, what must we animate here? How should we take care in our reading and writing and holding of Corin? I submit we must find ways of reading and writing that register the ways Black people reorient their relationships to toxicity, insanity, death, and what it means to inhabit a life worth living. We are off the map, Frank Wilderson reminds us, with respect to the cartography that charts civil society semiotics. Corin was aware of her proximity to lead and the ways in which that proximity and her own relationship to the state overdetermined her life. She ruptured the logics of a cartography that placed her life and body outside of claims to movement and autonomy in a fully possible life. She refused her conscription to slavery. This is a reorientation, a modality that accepts the conditions of Blackness. This is a reorientation that operationalized a radical praxis that refuses abjection on a registered, disinterested, and liberal humanist constructions of living or humanity. This is, to quote Christina Sharp, Black life lived in, as, under, and despite Black death. So where do we go from here? Thank you.